Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Daniel McAdams is with me today, the co-host. Good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. We talked the other day about torture and what went on at Guantanamo, and now Guantanamo's in the news. And the president made a promise many years ago. We talked about it when he was a senator. He did not agree with the principle that allowed Guantanamo to be set up, and certainly the torture that went on. At least that's what we hear. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes. But anyway, he has stuck to his principle that he wanted to close down Guantanamo, but it's not gotten very far. Now he had to come up with a plan and present it to the Congress, so Congress would go along with this. And now we're into his last year, but he came up with a plan and issued that. And of course, it's controversial, but it isn't the plan so much that's controversial as the principle of whether we should have secret prisons or whether we should have had Guantanamo. And that, to me, is the big issue. But I see this as a major problem because it's so artificial. And we have a so-called war going on. It's an undeclared war, but a lot of people say we are in a war against terrorism. It's just like any other war, and we have to treat people and be very willing to sacrifice a little liberty when you're at war. At the same time, it's an undeclared war, so everybody gets mixed up on this. So we go over and we start shooting and killing and bombing people, and sometimes we come across some people who don't like that, and they're called very bad, very, very bad people, and they're jihadists, and they get captured and they got put in prison, in Guantanamo. But I think that's where the problem comes. World War II, you didn't have the discussion. It was a war, and they were prisoners of war. It was a declared war, and when the war was over, then there was repatriation. But here we are with still, after all these years, still with 91 prisoners there, 91 suspects, because everybody says, oh, jihadists, you can't release the jihadists. So that's where we are today, and there's a lot of things that went on, how these prisoners arrived there, and why we should be talking more about a system to clean up a system that really got out of control. And we shouldn't make the assumption that everybody there is a guilty terrorist and they were vicious and they were out to kill Americans and settled in, so they don't deserve rights, is more or less the position that the far right wing takes.
Yeah. Well, it's conceptually, the problem is that the war on terrorism, as you've pointed out many times, is the war on an ideology, whereas World War II was a war against Hitler's Third Reich and Imperial Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So when you captured someone on the battlefield while you're battling the Nazi German army, then you take them in as war prisoners. But with a battle of ideas, you're capturing people because they are suspected of holding the wrong ideology. So you have this situation where so many people have been captured on the word of a neighbor or a rival tribe, and they've been taken up and sent to Guantanamo. So you have sort of a conceptual problem with not looking at war as a war on a specific thing, but as an idea.
And they got paid for this too. If they turned somebody in, our government would then pay them for turning them in.
Very well, yes.
And of course, we have examples of young teenagers being put in prison for long periods of time and not getting any due process, whatever. Not a very good example for American jurisprudence.
Well, Peter Van Buren, who we feature a lot of his work on the site, we've had him at some of our lunches in the old days. He wrote about this young fellow, Mustafa Shamiri, who was picked up at age 24. He was just the same thing. They said he was a jihadist, and someone probably collected a good reward for him. He languished for 13 years in Guantanamo, protesting his innocence, was denied any kind of hearing or trial or anything. Finally, 13 years later, they said, well, the testimony against him has been discredited, so we're going to let him go. And now he's, 30-some years old. He's had, some of the best years of his life stolen from him.
And whether he can adjust when he goes back home or not is a big question. There is one question that you're almost not allowed to ask or contemplate, and that is, what if these so-called terrorists see themselves as defenders of their homeland because they see people coming from far away, thousands of miles away. They've dropped a lot of bombs, and then they start occupying these countries. And they can get pretty annoyed just because they see themselves as defending their homeland. Does that qualify this sort of almost mystical condemnation? Well, he's a terrorist because he wants to kill us, and they will at times deliberately kill civilians. But they'll say, well, what do? How many times? You won't call it killing civilians. We come up with the term that these thousands that have been killed as collateral damage, as if they weren't people and it was an accident. And I don't think our government literally does it on purpose, but I think people in wartime are totally inept and they're totally blinded to how the people in these far Middle Eastern countries see what is happening. You know, it's something, if you don't understand that, then you say, well, they're all jihadists, and if they declare that they don't like Americans, and if you come here, we're going to shoot at you, and then it gets all this confusion of who gets turned in. And then we end up with this dilemma. Really, it's a dilemma. What do you do with people? It's not a lot of people, but on principle, it's pretty darn important. What will happen to these 91 prisoners right now, suspects, in the foreseeable future? Because right now it doesn't look like the Republicans will ever permit, you know, any type of a solution. And there are some solutions that we could suggest.
Well, you bring up a very delicate question, which is the issue of what these people were doing in places like Afghanistan and Iraq to have them labeled enemy combatants. You know, we know that the Iraq War was based on lies. It was an aggression against a country that hadn't attacked us. In Afghanistan, it was a war of regime change against the Taliban that were not good guys, but they did not attack us. It was a different group. They hailed from a different country in the Middle East that attacked us. So, of course, obviously, no one in their right mind would want to see American soldiers killed, but in some ways it is writ large of what you had pointed out earlier, the absurdity of claiming that Iraq aggressed against us by shooting at our planes as we bombed them.
Right. Now, the court system. Obama would send some people here to be tried in federal court. There's a claim, you know, there's some of them say, look, you know, I was involved and I did this. I will plead guilty, get me through the system, but just give me a little bit of justice because I wasn't out to start World War III and explain himself. But no, people are hysterical, way over the top. Because if they politicize this, because right now, especially in the presidential election, if you do anything to look like you might be weak or be willing to try to understand this, you're some type of un-American. If you want to defend the Constitution and American principles, you're seen as being anti-American. But there are some, on the internet, you can find stories that said that there's 500 jihadists that have been tried and put in prison. I don't quite believe that because that was probably a careless definition. And then others, they said there were 190 who were suspects and they were tried and put in prison during the Bush administration, but you never hear anything about that. But probably the most important example happened, I think it was in 1994, a year after the towers were, you know, bombed, the first time the towers were bombed in New York. And they were pretty bad people. Yeah. And they were out to kill, they were here, and they broke our laws, and our government found them and tried them in the courts, in a federal court, convicted them, and I think most of them are serving a life sentence. But there were 7 of those individuals. It's not like it can't be done. It's that they don't want to be done. And I saw one excuse by some of these warmongers. They said, well, that is true, but we could try this, but it'll get messy because they would have to be granted constitutional rights, and they don't deserve it. So this is the whole thing. They just don't want it out in the open. The same way they didn't want it out in the open about the report on torture. Oh yeah, boy, if they ever knew what we were doing down there. So that's why we have to compel the secrecy of the investigation about what was going on in Guantanamo.
And they say that it's un-American to question this, but how un-American is it to have such disdain for our system of justice, for this idea of a fair jury trial? You know, Jacob Hornberger, who we've had on the show and is our long friend of ours, we featured an article by him a couple of months ago where he made the good point that the reason they designed Guantanamo the way they did is they wanted a guaranteed outcome no matter what the facts of the case were. They wanted a military tribunal made up of military officers. Torture was allowed. Hearsay evidence is perfectly fine. No right to confront your accuser. So you have a guaranteed guilty verdict. Well, how is that any different than a Soviet court or a Nazi court? So these are the people who are anti-American.
Yeah, they sound very un-American. You know, the other thing about people ending up on these lists and in prison and nobody knows that they did anything wrong and get stranded there for many, many years, if not decades. But, you know, and they say, well, yes, they are, and we'll have to just accept this. This is tough business. But just think about under very different and more calm circumstances in this country when they want to look for bad Americans and we have to curtail their travel. Well, the TSA will put you on a list. How many times have they messed up on that? You don't go to prison because you're on the list, but you get imprisoned in it. You can't get out of the country, you know, and they harass you and you can't get your name off this list. So you can see how this whole system is just so unfair and unconstitutional.
Well, that's a great point that you make, because in the TSA, you're right, it's a controlled circumstance. They speak the same language generally. They have access to so much more information about Americans, yet they still make tons and tons of mistakes. Try operating in somewhere like a village in Afghanistan, remote, probably no electricity, don't speak the language, and somehow, in this case, you got the perfect guy, but so many mistakes at home. So we know for a fact that these are suspects. They've not been convicted of anything, and we know for a fact that many of them are picked up by mistake.
And, you know, I made the point early on that most of this comes from the fact that war is nebulous. It's not declared, and the Congress endorses it by financing it. The presidents do it by fiat, by just executive orders, and it confuses the court system and everything else. The Geneva Conference, and it doesn't make any sense. But that is an important principle. But I think there's another one, too, that has been ingrained in our society, and nobody seems to ever question it, is we hear people say, no, even George Bush, when he ran in 2000, I don't think we should be the policemen of the world. You know, if we're an aggressive nation, if we're arrogant, they won't like us, this sort of thing. And so they know that rings sort of a bell. But there doesn't seem to be many questions about rounding up people. I'm not talking about in the Middle East where they've been in battle. They're trying to fight the invaders. No, I'm talking about where we have gone. You know, right now, that big drug dealer that's in Mexico that they finally got, we're trying to get him in the United States and try him here, and who knows, we'll put enough pressure on the Mexican government to send them up, send them into the United States. But what about Noriega? You know, this guy was probably a detriment, you know, to Panama. But the Panamanians had a responsibility to do something. But he was our guy. He worked with the CIA. And he probably, the evidence is pretty good about him working with the CIA in drugs until he became an independent operator. So we turn on him and we declare war against him, or, you know, we don't like him anymore. So we go down and arrest him, bring him up to a United States court and try him and put him in prison. That has to be such an arrogant attitude. And someday what I worry about is someday we might not be the powerhouse, the military powerhouse, or the economic powerhouse, and there's going to be a lot of resentment out there. And I think that'll just fuel the fires of anti-Americanism, which could be very unpleasant.
Well, they use this idea of American exceptionalism that gives us the excuse. I was just reading this morning that John Kerry said if the Syria ceasefire doesn't work, we're going to go to Plan B and we're just going to have to partition the country, as if somehow we have the authority to draw the lines. But I was going to ask you, I know we're getting close to a close, I know, but what do you think can be done about the Guantanamo? What do you think? Do you have in your mind some kind of a solution?
Well, it isn't easy. The conflict I see, and there is a constitutional conflict, because I don't think they were well motivated, but the Congress did an explicit prohibition to the president that he couldn't spend money to bring any prisoner to the United States. But there's a limit to instructing a president on how he deals with military matters. The Congress can't pass a law at the last minute before a major battle in World War II, Congress can't pass a law and say, don't spend any money on the invasion of Europe. You can't do that because the commander-in-chief is the commander-in-chief, and he's in charge of the military. Guantanamo is a military base. He's moved troops around already. He's moved prisoners around. The prohibitions against moving individuals into this country. Well, I think wisdom would guide a lot of people on sorting this out and releasing a law and maybe taking care of some. But I think I'd like to ask some others who have studied the Constitution quite clearly. But my opinion would be that it's a military operation. The prisoners are held by the military. It's not by our Department of Justice. That maybe he could move these prisoners to a military base in this country and just close down Guantanamo because it's such a bad image. This is what is really harmful. And I keep thinking of all those horrible images and the images that we're not allowed to see. Just think of how routed we became when in the problem in Mogadishu in Somalia, when they dragged American soldiers through the street. This was despicable, and the Americans became outraged. Well, can't people sit and think, well, maybe people over there have some type of a moral outrage too when we bomb a village and kill people in a wedding party or something like that, or we bomb infrastructure and see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children die in Iraq because of our policy. It's this failure, the blinders they put on, and then their weapon is, oh, you blame America first. You're un-American. And here we're trying to say what the American constitutional position might be, but there's a lot who would like to turn that against us.
At least take away the recruiting tool called Guantanamo.
Yeah, there you go. And there's so many that deny the fact that this is a recruiting tool. I believe it is. I believe all our foreign policy is a recruiting tool. If you just look at it, right now we have a war against ISIS, and they're using the authority to go after Al-Qaeda after 9/11, to go after ISIS. ISIS didn't even exist. And so the more we're in there, and you could get rid of ISIS tomorrow, but there's going to be another group that will be anxious to get rid of us. We hope negotiation someday would help and move us along, but that's not going to solve the problem either. Only a definite shift in foreign policy and an attitude, and get rid of this idea that we own the world, we police the world, and that it's our moral obligation to do this. Anybody that resists us, they're the bad people, and we have to take care of them. I think a lot of Americans would accept this viewpoint if they get to hear about it, but they don't hear it on national TV, and sadly, they don't hear about it in the presidential debates. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.